Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Smith with the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Levi Sanchez, and whom I affectionately refer to as Susie, and that's how I refer to her from here out. And we have been conducting these interviews since the end of August, since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And what I want to do was just to check in. It's October 6th, I believe. Yes, it's October 6th, and just wanted to see how things are developing from Susie's perspective. Hello, Susie. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
Just fine. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks for having me again.
Sure. So just as I said in the introduction, let's sort of take a quick review of things. And from your perspective, I know you've had various communications with different groups around the world, and you certainly have, a lot of things have developed. So perhaps before we get into the question of governance, let's just, if I could just ask you to update some interesting things that have occurred in the past, say, 8 days since the last time we spoke.
I have to admit that I haven't been as deeply entrenched in the daily news in Afghanistan as I was before. Mm-hmm. So the day-to-day brewings of whatever, a few updates would be that international flights have been going on, and that, let me think, updates. Fighting in Panjshir continues despite what people are saying. Mm-hmm. Someone I just spoke to 20 minutes ago spent 4 hours in Panjshir last night fighting. So that is ongoing.
That implies the Taliban is not fully in control.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they're not. And women are not allowed in school, even though they were supposed to be. That is still ongoing. There is a rumor, and I don't know if it's a rumor or not, but the journalist Bilali Sarwar, who is regularly in contact with the Taliban, and I know him personally, tweeted that there are ISIS shadow leaders in just about every district in the north. Jamaat Ansarullah is continuing to be in control of 6 districts along the northern border of Afghanistan and Badakhshan, and that is the Tajik resistance group from Tajikistan. Uyghur fighters have actually returned, and there's more of them, allegedly. Some of them allegedly are cooperating with ISIS Khorasan. I don't know if that's true or not. Allegedly, Al-Qaeda also has various agreements with the Taliban, even though they weren't supposed to. I know we're going to talk about the governance issue, so I'm not going to actually address all of that right now.
Okay. Shall we segue into the governance issue? Given what you've just said, the question that occurs to many people is, how does the Taliban actually govern the country? And are they able to govern effectively? And if not, what's happening in its place to provide services?
I think that's a really important question. Like, what does Taliban governance look like, right, in the country? Because when we look back on Afghanistan pre-Taliban, we know that governance across the country was never cohesive. It was never a unified national plan. And it was always based on sort of local leadership, provincial governors. And part of the reason the Taliban were able to make such headway is for the past decade, they've had a very slow, almost like smoke spreading through the country, gaining access or control in various districts, provincial governments. Sometimes they had shadow governments, sometimes they were actually in positions, and other times they had just agreements with local leaders, depending. And then over time, from what I understand, is they actually paid off some of these provincial and district governors prior to their takeover so that there could be a bloodless takeover. Mm-hmm. So that's where the prior Afghan government was. It was a government based on both underlying agreements that were not within the government framework, as well as this eroding set of Taliban associated leaders. There's not one coherent Taliban group, and there never has been. So when we then transfer the Taliban, which are allegedly in control now, that we negotiated with in Qatar, or Doha, whatever it was Doha, yeah? What was it we negotiated?
Yeah,
sorry.
that sounds correct.
Yeah, sorry. These are whatever. This is one of these brain cramp issues. But but when we look at that, we negotiated with the Taliban. Mm-hmm. The Taliban were kind of all of these little sub leaders that were negotiating back deals with each district and provincial government. So now move to today, when we now have an official Taliban government. What do they govern? How do they govern? What does that mean? They suddenly don't have a national coherent strategy or plan or control. And so what is a government supposed to do, right? It needs to control the military and security forces. Mm-hmm. It needs to control to an extent or have the ability to administer the economic system. It needs to be able to have a coherent diplomatic foreign policy strategy. Mm. It needs to be able to promise the flow of trade of some kind. It needs to provide basic access to basic goods by having roads, bridges, water systems and whatnot flowing. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a working banking system. There needs to be some kind of healthcare system that's there. So basically there's a whole set of institutions that the government needs to either have in place or be forming on some level. Mm. So let's look at that. Let's start with the military. We'll go with the military, we'll go with the economy, we'll go with social welfare, and then discuss a little more from there. So the military security forces, it's not just military, but the whole Afghan security spectrum. What does that look like now that the Taliban? So my dogs are howling. Of course they are. So they're very excited about the Afghan security situation. So, and the Taliban. So, sorry, we're not torturing our dogs in the background, I promise. So, I'm sure it's like an Amazon delivery going on. So, okay, so so Taliban are in control of the military, the police force, the intelligence network, and any other security forces, allegedly. But when they came into power, they used a bunch of foreign fighters in the north, which I talked about earlier, like Jamaat Ansarullah, the Uyghurs, ITEM, which is the Islamic Turkestan, Eastern Turkestan movement. And then there's, groups like Haqqani Network and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups that are in there. The thing they seem to not be working with is ISIS, as far as I can tell. They're still in contention with them. But so if they have all these outside security sort of forces in there, that's one thing. The other thing is you have these sort of young Taliban fighters that were drawn in, but aren't professional soldiers, which I've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
And they continue to commit various atrocities in different districts and provinces. And people in some of those districts and provinces are fighting back.
Mm.
And they're not accepting those Taliban fighters as a legitimate police or military force. So those they're viewed as still sort of Taliban fighters who are in control, but not as government or state representatives. And that's important.
Mm.
Because if people don't view them as that, they're always going to view them as hostile outsiders,
Mm.
as opposed to forces that are there to protect the country and protect the people. Now, the Afghan government also had all kinds of corruption and problems within the police forces in particular, and within the military. But even with all that corruption and problems, we have problems in the US too, they actually were a legitimate force, as problematic as they were. I don't believe in most places there are some places it seems where the Taliban seem to have, they were more entrenched before, they had sort of legitimate leadership before, and people are accepting them as both security forces and as police, whatnot. But in a lot of parts of Afghanistan, that's not happening, particularly when you have outside fighters who are representing the Taliban as a separate group. Then the people really don't view, it's kind of like having a mercenary in your town that's taking everything from your economy and raping your women, and how are they ever going to become legitimate? So that there's all kinds of holes and pockets and problems within the entire security apparatus. So that's a governance system that right now is completely failing in many ways. Mm. So even if the Taliban have control of the airport, even if they have control of trade, even if they have control of these various things, it doesn't mean that they have, as Tilly puts it, a monopoly on the use of force in the country whatsoever, because people are not really viewing a lot of those groups as legitimate. So that's one thing. So do you have any questions about the security? So then on to the economy. Let's look at the economy. What's the economy? The economy needs to provide trade, banking, access to jobs, proper pay, all kinds of things. So trade is being inhibited because the Taliban are trying to control different aspects of trade, which means that certain people who are not within their legitimate, whatever they view as legitimate, they're harassing them, and there's problems, from what I understand, with having a free flow of trade around the country so people have access to food and basic necessities. That's been a huge problem. So that means that people are getting hungrier and having less and less.
And you told me you had gotten some messages from people who are now asking, they were previously asking how to get out of the country. Now they're asking is how to eat because they don't have resources. They don't have cash.
I get messages every day asking for money in order to buy basic necessities now. And that's going to get worse. I was just talking to another Afghan friend of mine who is an American citizen, who said he's getting the same thing. He said every day he gets 20 to 30 people requesting money for basic necessities, and he doesn't know what to do. We were both literally 5 minutes before I talked to you, I was on the phone with him talking about that, and how it's so painful to get all of those messages all the time. And the other challenge I have to say with some of the messages is, so I'd say about 50% of the people I know in some way through an NGO, somehow I know, but I also get a lot of messages from people I don't know. Now, if they're connected to someone I know, I feel better about it. Mm-hmm. Or if I've seen a HR letter that proves that, I've seen their tazkira, which is their birth certificate and their passport and their HR letter and their whole sort of package, and I help them put that together, I feel better. But there's others that, as one ex-special forces guy said to me, is you don't really know if they're a Taliban mole or, you know, someone trying to get information. And so it becomes like, how do you help people? And then how do you get money to these people too? I mean, that's what, like we were talking last week about the head of communications, former head of communications or information data for Afghanistan, who's in Iran. There's no way to get money to him. You know, he suggested Bitcoin. Well, obviously I'm not sending Bitcoin to Iran. You know, there's so many problems with that, but there's that problem too. And then there's the ones in Pakistan, and then you don't know if someone's contacting you from Pakistan, are they really them? And it just becomes, it's really gotten trickier. So we do need to create mechanisms for humanitarian aid as the economy begins to implode in Afghanistan. There's also, sorry, the dogs are now going crazy again. My daughter came in. I mean, there's also issues. So the banking is working supposedly, but most Afghans can't get money through the banks. And Western Union has a limit of 200 right now. I don't know if that's still going on. So there's all kinds of problems even getting money into the country that way. There's also problems getting humanitarian aid over the borders because, well, the Taliban have control of the borders. Many of the borders are closed by other countries because other countries don't believe the Taliban have control over the borders, which is another governance issue. And what is very frustrating is the trafficking is not having any problems with the borders. So you have all the billions of dollars of illicit trade just flowing along, but the legal exchanges and open borders are completely closed off. So that continues. And then the other issue we were talking about was social welfare programs. So the Taliban government is not paying teachers. It's not paying many civil servants that they view as kind of peripheral. There's no real civil servant or administration pay system. So all of those governmental institutions that provide access to basic social welfare like healthcare, education, fixing roads, water, all of that, there's no system right now to pay people to continue doing that. Now the Taliban said, we really want some civil servants to stay, you know, come back to your jobs, but then they have this vetting process, and many Afghans who are from a minority ethnic group or from a family that may have helped the US government, they're not going to come back to be vetted, because what does that mean? A number of Afghans I know, one of them is a nurse in a hospital in Panjshir, and he sent a CCTV video to me that was shared with him by someone at the hospital. And that CCTV video showed the Taliban coming in and allegedly asking for him because his family had helped the US military. And he said that the Taliban have done that now 3 times. And that, and so you could see the Taliban coming in, you could see them angrily looking, talking to the security officer, the security guard at the hospital, and then leaving, but they were there for a while. There's another contact of mine who moves from house to house continuously. So those are all people who have worked in various aspects of social welfare programs in the country that are in hiding. That could be useful to the country, but they can no longer do anything. So I'm trying to think, what other social welfare, I mean, who's going to fix the roads? Yeah, you know, the roads go out all the time. There was also the explosion that happened in Kabul recently too. That was at the funeral of the mother of Baradar, I think. I'm not sure. It was a Taliban leader's mother. It was a funeral, and it was at the mosque. in Kabul, and there was a big explosion. And I don't know, I don't know if anybody claimed responsibility for it at this point.
So it was an attack of some type.
Yeah, a bunch of people died.
Okay.
It was a major, it was a IED that went off. So I'm sorry, I should be up on that. I should have looked that up today, but I don't, they didn't know if it was sort of resistance or ISIS at this point, which is important to know.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of other aspects of governance. I mean, so when I look at this whole, so the passport office is open in Kabul right now, and allegedly they are actually processing passports for people who had prior applications in.
Oh, okay.
So a friend of mine's brother went there because his passport had expired, and the Taliban basically said, we're not processing any new passports at this new requests, only the old ones. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to say how much they're going to slow roll the old requests and who they're, from what I mean, another contact of mine went there and he was asked for $600 or $800. I can't remember how much to have his done, like to bribe. So that's not a legitimate office if it's really about who's paying bribes to get their passports done, right? And it's just people who are connected or whatever. But it is amazing that it's open. Trying to think what else. I mean, there's so much that goes on in terms of what's needed for a government to run. Like if you have a provincial governor, there's a whole staff. And if the staff is really a bunch of Taliban fighters and their main means of pay was through the illicit economy and illicit trade and bounties they get by controlling villages, that's not the government paying them. That's just a looting of the people's wealth, the sort of collective community wealth.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's still going on, but I suspect a lot of that is still going on. So when I look at the whole picture of governance, there is no governance, right? So while and I'm going to compare it once again, going back to the Afghan government, which had all kinds of problems, and there was local governance, really, which is what controlled everything, were the local leaders and these informal networks and whatnot. That went on. But there was a larger framework that was a loose structure that people kind of normatively agreed was there.
Yeah.
So if the road breaks, it may not get fixed for a long time, but in association with international funding and whatnot, that thing will eventually get fixed again. If a major waterway breaks, eventually it's going to get fixed. If schools were open and running and teachers were getting paid, hospitals were open, people could get healthcare. It wasn't great all the time. They had access to medicine. So as those things erode, because the Taliban are not creating or building on the systems that were there, the people are going to get progressively more desperate. And then the question is, as the saying goes, the strong do what they will, and the weak do what they must. So as the weak, so to speak, or the marginalized groups and non-Taliban villagers begin to get desperate, they're going to do what they must. And I don't know what that's going to be. Winter's going to be really tough. Unless the Taliban decide that, well, we're going to actually try to form a legitimate government. We're going to try to form a coalition government, and we're going to try to govern the country and all the institutions that means, that is defined by governance within a country or a nation state. So I don't know if that.
I think that's a good, perhaps that's a good place to end it for this talk, and we can pick it up in the following week. But this has been very helpful, a little bit distressing at the same time, but very interesting. Yeah, so but thank you for your insights, and thank you for that analysis. Is quite good. And just a reminder, our discussions today are reflecting our own individual views, and in Susie's case, she's speaking in her personal time and her personal capacity. So just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
Great, thank you.